Welcome back, students. Glad you could tune in for today's lecture on April 1st, 2020. We're going to pick up where we left off again with the civil rights movement. We've gone into the early 1900s all the way back to 1905 with the Niagara movement. And today we're going to pick up in the 40s and we're going to take this into the 50s. So in 1941, President Roosevelt pushes for movement in the equal hire, equal shot, basically giving African Americans a more fair opportunities in the workplace or in search of work. You know, trying to eliminate any race-related questions on job applications, or providing defense for an African American who was passed over for a job, which that still kind of happens today, and it's still a bit of an issue. So you can imagine the difficulties in 1941 in enforcing something of that magnitude. In 1942, the Congress of Racial Equality, which was known as CORE, is founded by a man named James Farmer. There's a big group of founders of CORE, but they push for racial equality, not just racial equality, but equality regardless of sex, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. They pursue equality of all kinds during this time. And it's a pretty popular movement. The group grows into the 100,000s, and it has quite a bit of influence. And one of the reasons that it has so much influence, why it has maybe more influence than the hundreds of other organizations that are created in hopes of finding equality, one of the reasons this one was one of the more successful ones is because it had the backing of a lot of white people. When this is founded, the original couple hundred members, 2/3 of them are white. And so it actually helps push the agenda of the organization. Now, CORE is motivated by nonviolent protests. Kind of, as mentioned yesterday, the Booker T. Washington theory, but even further. They were, especially Farmer, they were motivated and inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was a massive figure in the world at this time. In the 30s and 40s, Gandhi is in India, and he is advocating for freedom and peace in India from British rulers. At that time, India was still a British colony, and there was a lot of strife and a lot of conflict between the two sides. And Gandhi was known for hunger strikes and sit-ins and all these types of nonviolent protests. And so CORE starts to adopt those, and they start studying him and follow, because this is right in the middle of Gandhi's reign as leader of these protests. So this is where CORE is responsible for introducing a lot of the nonviolent protesting to the civil rights movement. Sit-ins, silent protests, bus riders that will come in the 50s. They are bred out of CORE, which is inspired by Gandhi. So it all connects. In 1944, a man by the name of Gunnar Myrdal a man from Sweden, I believe. Sweden or he's from somewhere in Europe. I know that's very broad, but I can't remember if it's Sweden or Switzerland. But either way, he's an outsider, and he is asked to write an essay or kind of a research paper on America's racial tensions. And it's called An American Dilemma. Like, this is basically a research paper that he's being paid by an organization. I can't remember the name of the organization, but this organization wants a an idea of how things are going. Like, and the biggest thing, the reason they got Myrdal to do it is because they want an outsider's perspective. They didn't want Americans' perspective, because an American's perspective during that time, especially, is going to be inherently biased one way or the other. And so they decided, let's go with an outsider. So Myrdal comes in, writes this essay, and in it he writes about how the situation is tense, and the people are uneasy, and he kind of paints this dire picture about it's a problem. The civil rights struggle is an issue in America, and then he goes into the reasons why, and he traces it back to this endless cycle throughout generations of white Europeans would discriminate against African Americans and leave them in the dust, leave them with really no opportunities to crawl out of this hole that we've put them in. And then those white people would say, well, they're inferior because you see how much they're struggling. You see how unsuccessful they are. Well, that's the problem right there, is we're leaving them, at these disadvantageous positions, and then we're saying, well, that's why we're not helping them, because they can't handle it, stuff like that. So Myrdal said, well, there's really two options here, or there's a couple solutions in this chain of events, because the two aspects of it are just that. The African Americans are left in this hole and they can't get out. And then white people say, well, they can't get out because they can't handle it, blah, blah, blah. So Myrdal says, well, you can either solve white people's discrimination, basically breed generations and breed people of understanding and compassion, to where over the course of generations, then African Americans can be brought out of this disadvantaged position and be risen up. That's one way to look at it. But and he says, or we could flip it and provide all this assistance and aid to African Americans to bring them out of the pit, and then white people will then see that, no, they're not inferior. They are, they're, with some assistance, they are able to sustain success. So, but each of these has a bit of a problem attached to it. The first option I mentioned about changing discrimination patterns, and then using that to uplift African Americans out of the cycle, is that takes a long time. That takes quite a while, and it takes generations and generations, and you still never really get that little sense of discrimination out in some of them. And the issue with the other solution is that breeds conflict. You're putting all this effort and money and time into helping African Americans, someone that a lot of whites, especially in the South, didn't like, and then you're lifting them to their level and then threatening them. That was the biggest thing, is they would feel threatened by the success of an African American, and that's going to breed conflict. And so looking back at our history, we can see time periods where each of those solutions per se is being used. The 60s was pretty well an entire movement to lift African Americans up and out of the hole, and then it threatens white people, and then violence ensues. And there's been periodic events throughout the rest of history along with that. But for the first solution, I think that's kind of what has been going on, is slowly you start to hopefully change people's perceptions, change white people's perceptions in defining African Americans more equal. And now we're seeing today where we still have people that have kind of a possibly racist mindset, but I don't want to call it, sometimes just ignorance, ignorant mindset. But it's way fewer than it used to be. That's how long that kind of process takes over time to change. But that's what Myrdal posted in his An American Dilemma. It was a huge success. It was a bit like sold millions of copies, and it really shaped the civil rights movement from there. But well, I talked about that a lot more than I planned on. Okay, sorry, went past that one. In 1946, the Committee on Civil Rights is created by Harry Truman. It's a temporary committee that is meant to basically, again, assess the civic strife and come up with solutions. And they come up with a couple solutions. Harry Truman issues an executive order in 1948 to desegregate the military, to get rid of all white and all black regiments in the military. Now that takes time. Something like that takes quite a while to fully create and fully do, just because the military is the oldest American institution there is. Like that was the first American thing ever, was the American military. So tradition is extremely hard to break in the military. And so that, even though he made an executive order that said, you can't segregate the military, it still took a while to integrate the Marine Corps and the Navy and the Army and all that. And then in 1947, Major League Baseball, I should say integrated, not desegregate. Oh, sorry, no, reading error. Yeah, they did desegregate when Jackie Robinson joins the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, being a baseball person myself, I could speak forever on this. I'll try not to. Major League Baseball had barred African Americans from playing. But again, it's one of those de facto rules or de facto laws. There was nothing in the books that said an African American couldn't play on the team. It was just kind of a silent agreement from all the owners in baseball that said they weren't going to hire an African American. And then Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, decided to break that rule and sign Robinson to a contract. He's a very successful player. He's a Hall of Fame baseball player for his accomplishments on the field, but his impact in the civil rights movement is a million times greater than any impact he had on the baseball field. And he's maybe the most well-known baseball player in the history of baseball. His jersey numbers retired by every single Major League Baseball team. So it hits the sports world as well. Civil rights movement hits every aspect of life in America. Now, the big event is Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. This is a case of, in no other place than Topeka, Kansas. A young third grade African American girl is being forced to go to a school miles and miles away, an all black school miles away on the other side of town. and she's being forced to walk like a mile to her bus stop to pick her up and take her to school, when about 6 blocks in the other direction is another elementary school she's not allowed to go to because of her being African American. And so they take it to the courts, or they challenge the school board. School board doesn't do anything. They challenge state courts. They don't do anything. So they take this to the Supreme Court. Now, this is not the first case of a family versus a school board on the grounds of racial segregation. In fact, there's quite a few. None of which are really that successful. The reason this one is specifically successful is because it focused actually more on the convenience of going to a nearby school than on the conditions of an African American school. And so that's when the Supreme Court of the United States decides, hey, that's true. This whole separate but equal kind of causes an inconvenience, and it's not fair to the kids. Now, this is kind of a state issue because there are certain states in the whole South, the entire South of the U.S., they had state rules that they were de jure segregation. They were on the books. They were legit laws that said African Americans could not go to school with white people. Then other states in the North and out West had laws in the books that didn't allow segregation. Like they enforced integrated schools. And then there's a couple states that had really no laws, kind of up for grabs, and it really depended on the type of people there. Kansas was one of those states where there's no laws, but segregation is kind of practiced. At that time, there was a law saying that there's no segregation of schools at the high school level, but anything below, so elementary and junior high, segregation was a thing, unfortunately. And this overturns the doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, which we talked about earlier, the separate but equal conditions. They found out the separate does not pertain to equal, and if we're promising equal rights in our Constitution, then segregation kind of blows in the face of that. The attorney for the Brown family is Thurgood Marshall. He's an African American. He ends up becoming the first Supreme Court justice, first African American Supreme Court justice. 10 years later, or in 1954, he's pleading his case to the Supreme Court, and 13 years later, he's on the Supreme Court. He's a very influential figure also in the civil rights movement. Thankfully, the judges come to a unanimous 9-0 decision in favor of Brown. They come with the statement of, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. So they agree that in education, this doesn't get rid of separate but equal, only in education. They're only desegregating schools. Now, they don't issue a plan on how to do that. They don't issue any kind of, well, this is how we're going to get it done. In Brown versus Board 2, which is kind of a revisiting of this case where they come up with process and solutions, they ruled for desegregation with all deliberate speed, which, if you're wondering what does that mean, it means nothing. There's no way to measure with all deliberate speed. So schools all over the place in the South, wherever there was a problem with segregation, they took their sweet time. There was no rush on this. There's no, hey, by the end of the year, we've got to be desegregated. No, there's none of that. For years, schools in the South remained segregated. For over a decade, probably, in places like Alabama and Mississippi, schools remained segregated. They could still plead the case of, well, we're in the process, but it takes a while. Big issue with this is it can overpopulate schools, but it also school boards wouldn't hire African American teachers. So all these teachers at these old African American only schools, they were without a job, many of them, because very few of the integrated or desegregated schools would hire them. So that was another issue that came out of this time. And just there's a ton of opposition to this, and it becomes a real big contentious point in American history. We'll talk more about the conflict that comes out of this. But with that, we're going to go to our essential question. Remember, go to the essential question assignment on Classroom, open it, and if you haven't already, create a Google Doc. Now, if you've been doing this correctly the whole time, great, but I want to make sure everybody is on board. You open a Google Doc and you will go through and you will type this. You will do one document for the entire week, and you will just continue to add this question and this answer. And do not press submit or turn in until Friday after the last lecture. And then next week, we will do it all over again, okay? I understand that was probably confusing, but that was the goal of this whole thing. So on, on the essential question worksheet, you will type out what previous Supreme Court case did Brown versus Board challenge, and you will type the answer. We talked about the answer the first day of the lecture. We briefly talked about it today. Okay, it's the only other court case I think we've talked about so far. So simple question, simple answer. Don't overthink it. That'll be it today. Tomorrow, Zoom meeting. I changed my mind for this one. I want everybody there. Zoom meeting Thursday, 2 o'clock. Please join. I'll repost the link on Classroom probably Thursday morning, but I want everybody there. I didn't do a very good job of getting this cleared up and getting things out there. So please show up. I won't lecture. I will record a lecture later on and post it that day. It'll be a short Zoom meeting. I just want to feel everybody's questions, give you guys answers, catch you guys up, make sure we can even have a question of the day. But I want everybody there so I can track some attendance real quick. So, all right, guys. Hey, thanks for tuning in. I will see you guys all tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Have a terrific day. Oops.